afternoon and welcome to the conference session, Creating a Welcoming Downtown Through Collaboration and Partnerships. I'm Dr. Dave Crass, and I'm privileged to serve as Director of the Historic Preservation Division in the Department of Community Affairs. I'll be the moderator for this session. I'd like to begin with a couple of housekeeping matters. First, be sure to keep your mic muted during the presentations. Second, if you have any questions during the session, which will be a panel discussion, feel free to type them into the chat. One of us will read them during our panel discussion. You can also use the raise your hand function. Third, this session will be recorded and will be available after the conference to you and others who are unable to attend today's session. And finally, you'll receive an evaluation immediately following the presentation, and that will also be emailed to you. Please do complete that because we value your feedback. And now for our session contributors. Jessica Reynolds is the Director of the Office of Downtown Development at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs. The Office of Downtown Development serves as the state's only coordinating program for the Georgia Main Street Network. Representing more than 100 communities statewide, the Georgia Main Street program utilizes unique preservation-based economic development tools to provide communities with the support needed to revitalize their historic commercial districts. Since the program's inception, Georgia's Main Street cities have had a $6 billion impact, leading to the creation of more than 77,000 net new jobs. Jessica graduated from the University of West Georgia in 2007 and received her Economic Development Finance Professional Certification in the fall of 2018. In 2013, Jessica was the recipient of the University of West Georgia's inaugural 30 Under 30 Award. This award recognizes 30 alumni that are 30 years of age or younger that have made significant impacts in their career industries. Melissa Jest has been the Historic Preservation Division's African American Programs Coordinator since 2016. Ms. Jest assists individuals and communities in identifying and preserving African American historic sites and properties significant to Georgia's heritage. She also serves as liaison to the Georgia African American Heritage Preservation Network. Ms. Jest brings nearly 20 years of outreach experience, having worked in Savannah, Philadelphia, and at the national level at the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C. Her commitment to promoting historic preservation as a tool for empowerment has earned her recent election to the board of the 1772 Foundation, the only national foundation that specifically supports historic preservation and farmland conservation. Ms. Jest is a native of Savannah and holds a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism from the University of Florida and a master's degree in urban studies from Savannah State University. We'll also hear from Lily Reed, Cartersville's Downtown Development Manager, who will discuss, among other things, an African American heritage trail that she helped develop. Lily has served as director of the Cartersville Downtown Development Authority and Main Street program since June of 2015. She holds an undergraduate degree in English with a minor in religious studies from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. She also has a master's certificate of heritage preservation from Georgia State University, as well as a master's in public administration from Appalachian State, where her concentration was in local government administration. While in graduate school, Lily spent over a year working with the town of Wilkesboro, North Carolina, developing their small town Main Street program. Prior to coming to Cartersville, Lily spent 3 years in the city of Dunwoody as deputy city clerk, where she was exposed to a wide variety of community development projects. That experience, coupled with her prior Main Street work, have greatly informed her views about growing and promoting downtown. She enjoys bringing new and interesting partners into the district while remaining active and engaged with existing stakeholders. This session will focus specifically on issues and questions surrounding making historic downtowns more welcoming for underrepresented visitors, businesses, and residents, with a particular focus on the African American community. While none of us up here claim to have all the quote-unquote answers to the challenges that we'll discuss, our discussants do have a wealth of hard-earned experience and insights gained through decades of work in downtown redevelopment and historic preservation. Our format is pretty straightforward. I'll pose a series of questions to the discussants, and then I'll turn control over them to see what kinds of insights we can develop out of those discussions. So let's get started. One of the goals in downtown revitalization is to create an environment that's diverse and inclusive. Historic downtowns are characterized in part by their human scale and public spaces, so they should be, by their very nature, welcoming. Yet there are often communities that don't feel like downtown is quote unquote for them. What are the challenges, either real or perceived, that keep downtowns from being viewed as inclusive spaces that we can all enjoy? And Melissa, why don't you kick off this discussion?
Well, sure. As a historic preservationist, I've been taught by my various constituents over the years that we got to look at the past. You got to look at your history to better understand your present and of course, to better plan for the future. And so, and with us being, one of the oldest states or part of the United States, we have a long, varied history. And there are some tragic parts of that history that have lent itself to making for an unwelcoming kind of environment downtown. For instance, one of our older cities on the coast has a law on the books that gave the constable the authority to remove Black bodies from the promenade, which was the southernmost boundary of that city's downtown area. And that particular law is still on the books. And so there are many jurisdictions, older towns and cities throughout the state that have similar precedences that kind of permeate into our current day planning and our current day policies and procedures. And we just kind of have done this behavior for so long, and it has unfortunately become automatic to where we don't even think about it. And so I would, encourage folks, working in cities around the state to stop and think about what the history is and do a little research and see, what has not only just the more recent history or information, but look a little further back and do some thinking about how present day policies might be perpetuating the separations and some of the more extreme kind of policies that have, either removed Black bodies or at least created an atmosphere that's not very welcoming.
Yeah, I think you hit on something really important there, Melissa, and one of those is intentionality, right? That we need to be intentional in all things that we do, whether it's programming, educational, economic development, community development, understanding our community inside and out. And that means sometimes that's harder than it sounds. And sometimes that requires us putting a mirror up in front of ourselves and saying, okay, this is our reality. And trying not to just sugarcoat the more tricky parts of it. And I think that downtowns absolutely can be a place of inclusiveness and diversity, and really should be, in its ultimate perfect design, a place for everyone. But there is this history that is real, that there's a lot of people who didn't feel like downtown was for them. And then, like you said, there's still places where there's policies and things on the books that, whether it's intentionally thought or just, accidentally ignored or whatever it is, but that they still exist. And I think that, it's really important that as community servants, as elected officials, as enthusiastic community members, that we have to be the advocates for those voices who aren't always heard. And we have to be active in making sure that downtown represents a little bit of something for everybody. And that means being honest with ourselves, truly knowing our demographics, truly understanding our community makeup, and asking ourselves, are we reaching everybody in the community? Or are we just kind of tapping into the same old? What are we doing to be, progressive and aggressive about making sure that we are being inclusive? And I think, Lily, you guys have had some of this experience that you could speak to in Cartersville, right?
Absolutely. Our African-American community core is less than a mile from our downtown, kind of established in that way through segregation and planning policies and different things. But what we have found is that in the absence of any sort of inclusivity, it didn't just magically appear. You really did have to be intentional about it. And so far, what we have found is that with intentionality and then follow through, that has made a huge difference. You know, when we were able to put our first sculpture up on the grounds of City Hall that showed representation for our African American citizens, that meant something. But then when we followed through with a heritage trail, okay, now you got one more step in the process. And okay, now we're doing a Toni Morrison Society bench by the road. And okay, now we're doing a voter registration drive downtown. And I feel like the more you show yourself to be a reliable partner, you know, the more that starts bridging that gap through intentionality, through follow through. And then of course, the biggest thing is representation.
Do you think there was that perception in Cartersville at some point, whether it's now or in the past, that downtown was for certain people, but not for everybody?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's still something that we are actively working against with our most recent community project. It was a citizen-driven project, and she explicitly said that she came downtown because after the Heritage Trail and the work that we did, she felt like the door was open. So obviously that has not been the case. You know, they did not feel like the door was open, especially I think in the absence of any intentional efforts by the local government, be that on the smaller scale with downtown or actually at the, you know, true city level.
And I think, Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have to think about this in the historical perspective as well. You know, that, you know, traditionally, maybe these historic commercial centers, they could have been slave markets. You know, they could have been places where slave trading was happening. And there's a historical reason as to why certain races don't feel like downtown is welcoming for them, because historically that was not a place that brought them comfort. You know, that was not the place that they wanted to go to. And
right.
You know,
and even more recently, you know the whole civil rights movement and those kind of interactions with dogs and hoses and all that. But like history, it offers you various perspectives, and you can turn that and you can focus on some of the more positive aspects of like individual tenacity and agency and the commitment of regular people who brought about a change, not only locally, but nationally. And so I think there is an opportunity with history, even though it can be painful and challenging, there's an opportunity to uplift and inspire. When I first learned in my own hometown about an African-American woman in the 1870s, she had a confectionery shop right on our downtown, you know, Main Street. And I was like, how inspiring. So even though, you know, it was challenging times, we were coming out of a war and so on and so forth, she found an opportunity and she found a space and was able to operate in that space. So always a chance to bring out the positive about individuals and inspire people and make people feel comfort, you know, in that, you know, that pride, that uplifting.
Yeah. And I think also it goes back to, you know, creating that inclusive, you know, and diverse space downtown means that we allow voices from all sides to be heard. You know, this is a place where, you know, we don't have to agree on everything, but that we can come together to have healthy discussions, to try and see each other's side, you know, and to see how we can move together forward as a community.
And that's where you do it, right? That's the civic center, our downtown. That's where you come together. That's where you voice your complaints. That's where you know, push, you know, the limits for improvements for everyone. So I agree.
Absolutely.
Very good. Okay, here's my next question for you guys. Economic data demonstrate that while 7% of white business owners get a loan in their first year of business, only 1% of Black-owned businesses do. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Black-owned businesses have also been disproportionately affected. For instance, a recent analysis by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that Black-owned firms have been almost twice as likely to have to close their doors as firms overall. Only 20% of Paycheck Protection Program loans went to areas that had the highest concentration of Black-owned businesses, the Fed found. What can communities do to begin to encourage minority businesses to open in our historic downtown commercial districts?
Well, I'll go ahead if I could and start with that. And you already kind of alluded to it, Jessica, in that, you know, Main Street is a very identifiable specific place, but we're talking about downtown, which is great because when you widen the lens, you get to include the African American historic corridors, like Lily mentioned, Summer Hill there in Cartersville. So if you expand, you can include historic African American corridors. A lot of those areas are still functioning. They're hanging on by a thread and are looking for support from their local jurisdictions and other places, and can be a very important part of that mix that you offer in downtowns around the state. So, I would encourage to, once again, look to the past, find where your African American business corridor is, and see what businesses are there that are still operating, that could stand a shot in the arm, and see if they even offer an opportunity for more recruitment to bring businesses in, not only on that corridor, but also maybe downtown. And back to your earlier point, Jessica, about intentionality. Being intentional about supporting businesses, period. I know that municipalities and jurisdictions work hard to recruit and support businesses, most of them mainstream. And so supporting, Black businesses with whether it's technical assistance or any other assistance is appropriate, and it's something that's been done. My short time in Washington, D.C., I was able to meet the Main Street director, and it was H Street Northeast. And they were very, very intentional about finding ways to subsidize the rents so that there could be a diverse offering of businesses on that corridor that was quickly changing, which was good. But they wanted to make sure to offer that mix of locally owned business, of minority and women-owned businesses, and they knew that they had to subsidize that. And so that Main Street program was very outspoken and very dogged about getting subsidy support from the district, for those businesses. So,
Melissa, you made a really interesting comment to me one day a couple of weeks ago. I think maybe we were talking about Sweet Auburn, and you said a phrase that stuck in my mind, which was, you need to let them be what they are. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. Again, historic Black corridors, you can find something very different than you find on main streets. And that, again, is a positive. We have to turn our perspectives to look at that positively. And so while the facade, may not have that, washed, sterilized kind of look, it might have some funky purples and oranges. I think we need to allow that type of cultural expression and that type of differentiation because it'll find its market. It'll find those that will come and who can appreciate that. And just being diverse and providing that variety, I think is what most business corridors and managers like you all want to provide, not necessarily try to bring what we think the mainstream, will feel comfortable with. They're coming to our areas to have a different experience. Else they would have stayed home, like anywhere USA.
Yeah.
You don't want to go to McDonald's when you're traveling. You want to go someplace that's got the local flavor.
Yeah, and I think all great points. We had someone in our chat make a comment that, with what we're talking about, are you saying that Black businesses are being discriminated against regarding the PPP or PPP program? And I don't think our intention was to say that Black-owned businesses were being discriminated. When Dave started his question, he mentioned that the data shows us that 7% of white business owners get a loan within their first year, but only 1% of Black business owners do. And I think that just shows that, and I've seen it myself, that there's a different approach to like financially funding your business and how we're going to like invest in ourselves when we're business owners. And so I can see that there would be some disparity, especially on the federal level, as far as who's getting money. Because again, it's all going to be about who's applying for it, who feels like they need it, who feels like they have access to it. And that also goes back to your community and relationships with the banks and stuff like that. So I don't think we were trying to get into the whole discussion of we think people are being discriminated against. I think we were just purely looking at the facts and saying factually, this money isn't going to majority Black-owned businesses, it's going to majority white-owned businesses.
And if you look at the history, I mean, if you have a history of being separated and not having access, then you're going to be at a different level of preparation to take advantage. You're going to be at a different level of knowledge of even knowing what to take advantage of. And so while we're not saying that it's overtly discriminatory, it's simply based on the history and Black businesses only being allowed a certain, access, a certain existence, a certain, access. It's going to put you behind. It's going to put you, at the back of the line. Yeah.
Kind of going to that educational awareness component too. You can't take advantage of something that you're not aware of, whether beyond just the PPP program, but any kind of program, any kind of local, whether it's local or state financial assistance program. If you're not tapped into the community, if you're not tapped into those resources and those people that know that information and have it, we have to be more active and intentional about making sure that we're sharing it with everybody, that we're getting this information out there, that whoever crosses our threshold, that we're engaging with. And I think Paul Jarrell in our chat made a really good point. He said, is there a cultural disconnect with what is offered in many downtowns that's not appealing to as many from the African-American community? And I think, again, that goes back to our intentionality that, and I will say, I mean, I've seen it before. We have some communities, and this is like, just a kind of a crazy random example, but communities who are like, we don't want a tattoo parlor because we don't want those kind of people downtown. What are those kind of people? People with tattoos? We have this, sometimes communities have this perception of we want certain businesses, but we don't want other businesses. And that can be as benign as something as a tattoo parlor to something much more racially insensitive and aggressive. And the reality is that Main Street folks and our folks in the downtown development world, this is an opportunity for us to step up and to be better about this, for us to be more supportive of minority and female-owned businesses. But that's only going to happen if we're intentional about it, if we are intentionally providing opportunities.
And it's about growth. You mentioned opportunity. It's about growth. Nielsen, the marketing firm, they reported recently that if you don't have a strategy for attracting multicultural populations, you don't have a growth strategy, because that is what is going to be needed, going forward if you plan on growing and sustaining your business. It says that African Americans have $1.3 trillion of buying power in this country. That's more than the gross domestic product of Australia.
Wow.
So it's it's about harnessing that as well. And as far as the heritage tourism traveler, you guys know this. They stay longer, they spend more. And African Americans in 2018 spent $63 billion in travel, and they're staying nearby. They're only traveling 100 to 500 miles from their home. So we got some folks spending some money, and they want to see themselves authentically represented. That was another part of the study. They want to see themselves in a positive light. They want to be welcome. They don't want to walk into a place, that's, not very welcoming. So.
Absolutely.
But Lily, I may have cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. And the train's about to come through here. I know I conjured that when I said it earlier, so I'm going to have to mute myself when the train comes by. But actually, I think you pointed it out, Jessica, that it's not just about the culture of the shops that are encouraged, but the entire culture that's founded on that creates that disconnect with the way that downtown is inviting. Okay, hold on, y'all.
I hear it. Yay.
But I think there are some things that we can do if we decide that and I would always say that before doing anything, you have to do that research. You have to understand what your community makeup is. You have to know your demographics. You have to know who you're serving. You have to understand your households. You need to have a realistic, view and picture of who you're working with and who you're serving. But if you look at your demographics and you have a 25% African American population, and nobody downtown is, a Black business owner, there's a disconnect there. So what can we do to incentivize that process? And I think that's where Main Street and community development and economic development can come into play, because we have the ability to connect everyone, to pull these resources and people together, whether that is working with the available properties and those property owners to do some kind of tiered rent, to do some kind of creative competition, marketplace competition, to get in specific types of businesses or to provide opportunities for specific types of groups. And, working with the chamber and working with the local media, to provide a complimentary chamber membership, to throw in some free advertising in the city, to be able to waive some fees, or whether it's business license or tap fees or signage fees or things like that, making it, if this is something that we think is important and this is something we want to address, then we're going to have to put some skin in the game to do it. We're going to have to set the example and figure out what we can do to help lead the charge in this area. We can't just sit back and wait and say it'll sort itself out. That's not the approach we need to take to it.
Absolutely.
Lily, are you back?
I'm here.
Was there anything else you wanted to add, Lily?
No, I completely agree with what you guys are saying. I think that's right on target. I mean, until we're doing that intentional work in every aspect of downtown, and in this conversation, it's going to continue to be status quo. So we got to do better. Not changing is not an option.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, again, we're going back to the education component, because there are things like historic tax credit programs out there for people who want to purchase and renovate property downtown. Some of our communities have the rural zone designation. Other business owners might be taking advantage of the Downtown Development Revolving Loan Fund program, but there's a lot of times an educational disconnect. And Lisa Farid from Stockbridge, shout out to Lisa, made a point that minorities need handholding sometimes for things like the PPP program, that very often minority entrepreneurs feel intimidated by the grant process, and they're not usually trained in how to go through and apply for grants or loans, and they believe that can be rigged or tricky, and may tend to stay away from it. Again, I think that goes back to our role in the community and needing to be educators and those kind of bridge builders to let people know that these programs are out there, but also that we're there to help with it, that it's not just, hey, here you go, you're on your own, but like, what can we do to help you through that process?
Guys, to follow up on this, you've sort of touched on African-American business districts and letting them be what they are. Do you have any examples of jurisdictions that have invested in revitalizing their historic Black-owned business corridors? And what would be one or two first sort of concrete steps a local jurisdiction could take to address this issue?
Well, I hate to be the Debbie Downer, but unfortunately, I have not encountered any communities, and I'm very welcome to learning about test cases and places. But in my travels and talking about historic preservation, and that includes the built environment downtown, I haven't really found that. I know that here in Atlanta, Sweet Auburn Works is a main street, and I've had the good fortune of meeting that particular manager, and he just wants to encourage the tone of intentionality when it comes to recruiting businesses to come and seeing Sweet Auburn Works as an option, especially for those culturally diverse type of businesses that would add to their particular mix, and being open to pop-ups, all of those buzzwords, incubators, those type of things that would so forth. So, but sorry to say, but I'm open to hearing about some other.
I have a couple examples we can talk about, and I want to go back to that point that Melissa was talking about, that traditionally we have these historic districts that have a white central core of businesses historically, and then adjacent to them or parallel in the area was the Black central business district. And the thing is that even today, we tend to see more investment happening in that traditional white central corridor than we do revitalization happening in these areas that were the historically Black business districts. But I will say we do have some communities that have invested in those areas and have seen a resurgence. And I will say too, I think when you have a community that versus looking for infill development, or let's say we've kind of grown and we need to grow more, like what can we do to pull in these other adjacent districts? Recognize their history, because I don't think we need to like wash over that. I think that needs to be an important component, recognizing their history. And then what can we do to make sure that we're intentionally investing in it and growing our footprint of downtown, instead of just having these areas that's traditional white or traditional Black. Let's make it, again, a downtown that's inclusive. And two of the communities that come to mind, Dublin, Melissa, they have some of their commercial historic Black-owned businesses, again, one street off the main corridor, and they've done some really cool, they have businesses there, but they've also done some intentionality in kind of creating gateways, entryways into that district with the MLK Memorial right there.
Yeah, I did go there.
And so I mean, I'm thinking of it when you kind of go in the back door to Dublin, not the main way, but when you're kind of going in the back door, you can turn there at the church where Martin Luther King gave one of his first public speeches, and they've done a beautiful memorial, a mural. They've done a beautiful mural. You've got the church there, you drive in, and they've got this beautiful area where they do what's it called? A farmer's market. There we go. A farmer's market on the weekends. And they've got some really cool businesses there. But, here's the thing too about investing in these areas that are more like off the beaten path. The price point's going to be better. There's usually more parking. And for some people getting in and getting set up and getting their business up and running, these are great opportunities. Another community that I think has done a good job investing in an area that was kind of off the beaten path a little bit, still connected to their downtown, is Thomasville. They had an area that was historically was called the Bottom, and they have spent a lot of money and time investing in this district over the past several years. So since 2014, they've seen over $10 million invested there, and about 4.5 of that was private investment that followed the 5.5 million of public investment. And that public investment went from everything from expanded sidewalks, lighting, landscaping, to uncovering the roads and the historic brick pavers down there, and to building an amphitheater, a place that the community can come together and engage and interact with each other. And I think one of my concerns, and I talked to Thomasville about this because I was like, I know that this has been something they've been working on for years, this area that they call the Bottom. And before leading up to this, I really, just wanted to kind of reach out to them and say, hey, how did this whole thing kind of go? And was there pushback from the community? And, what was the insight and stuff? And they said that, the community was definitely in support of investing in this area, but that they were concerned about calling it the Bottom. That wasn't a name that they gave it. It was that's what it had been referred to, and that's what it had been called. And the African American community came out and said, actually, like, we want to keep calling it the Bottom. We don't want to change it. That's how we know it. And as of today, they are installing historical markers on each of those businesses down there in the Bottom to reference the owner and the original business that occupied that building, to kind of give heritage and call out to the history of that area of the community, which I think is important. Again, let's not like wash over this. Let's make sure that if we're investing in these areas, which I think is important and we should, that we make sure we pay homage to it.
Sure, of course. And then I want to also give a quick shout out in Thomasville to the Imperial Hotel. That project, that's a great preservation project. And it was a Chitlin Circuit location where entertainers stayed when they came to perform during segregation, and a local preservation organization, Jack Hadley Black History Museum, Inc. is now kind of expanding their capacity and taking on a historic preservation project that they hope to also interpret and make available for possible stays. But go ahead.
And the Black History Museum was integral in the process of the plaques and making sure that the people who needed to be recognized, these historical important figures in the Black community, were being recognized in the way that they needed to be and called out. And I think that, it's great to see the city, trying to work with organizations and entities that they may not have had an official relationship with in the past. And I'm not saying, I'm not speaking to the relationship. I don't know what it was, but they were very intentional in saying, hey, this is one of the primary organizations that we worked with to do these plaques. And it was so important for us to do that because of the history that they had, that we wanted to make sure that we were representing.
And that's totally what Lily and her team did there in Cartersville.
Yeah, Lily, could you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, just about the trail generally, or as a city initiative?
All the above.
Okay, well, I actually, again, we just wanted more representation. It was an intentional effort. When we were looking over Sanborn maps, trying to kind of discern something about a walking tour that wasn't just important building, important building, important building, and talked a little more about the texture and the reality of the community. Of course, what hadn't been talked about was the minority experience. And so we went digging, but it was a lot of firsthand research. It was not an easy thing to discover. And some of the things that were interesting was that we found out in the period of time right after Reconstruction, or during Reconstruction, right up until about the 30s, there were 2 thriving business districts in downtown. But then due to various instances of violence, civil unrest, things that happened locally, again, going back to that history and why people don't feel welcome downtown, the echoes that you feel with that, it did tell us a lot about what had happened here, how the community was built by, white and Black people, and other minorities too. We actually had, Asian Americans and different races represented in that capacity. But that was a project that actually ultimately involved over 11 different civic and local partners. So we had the county, local government, every named city, every civic entity in the county, plus a lot of our historical groups, our historic Summerhill Heritage Center, and then we do have a nonprofit group that's a historic Rosenwald School. And since they were both sites and members of the community, they came in and were able to consult with that. And what I also want to speak to with that, you guys were talking about the history of place and how that impacts downtown. What I think I am starting to discover through this work is that when you let the African American community reinterpret places that were formerly used for their oppression, it brings a whole new element to the discussion. So, somebody mentioned earlier the idea that downtown isn't welcoming because of the Confederate monuments, and there's sometimes limited things we can do with that, but we can continue to add to the narrative. We can uncover new things to create for the narrative. And one of the things that came out of our African American Heritage Trail was that the DDA, we added our first Black board member, which was a fantastic experience out of that. And then in this train depot where I'm sitting, we have 2 waiting rooms, formerly black and a formerly white waiting room. But that same board member has now started the Etowah Bush Group, which is an African American arts, culture, and history group, and it's located now in our former African American waiting room. So these like kind of reclamation of the space, and again, open the door, and all of these amazing things kind of start to come to the surface. It starts to happen. People feel welcome. So it's kind of all over the place. It touches on a lot of stuff, but again, just bringing that intentionality, that representation, it goes a long way. You would be amazed at stuff that happens.
Just acknowledge it. Just acknowledge it, and you take some time and sit with it. Ideas will formulate on how to bring out the positive aspects. But if you're just rushing by it or rushing through it, you're going to miss an opportunity to edify yourself and others, and then also innovate, hopefully, with that history.
That's right.
And I think one of the worst things we can do, whether it's as elected officials or as community servants, is to dismiss how people feel about whether it's Confederate memorial statues or something else that's going on in the community or in the nation. Because I think it takes a lot of courage for someone to speak up and to say, this is how I feel about something. And the reality is that it's our job in these positions to say every voice needs to be heard, every opinion matters. And just because we don't necessarily understand it or agree with it doesn't mean it's not valid. Doesn't mean that the person speaking up doesn't have a true point and may feel that way. And I will say that in the 2020 environment that we live in, with everything that has happened this year, especially with George Floyd and the protests, and then people taking down the Confederate monument statues, I think that I've seen and listened to some city council meetings and had people say, elected officials say, we're not going to talk about this anymore. We're not entertaining any more discussions on this matter from the public or regardless. And I really feel like that's the wrong approach, because you're saying what you have to say doesn't matter. That's not important, or we don't agree with you and we're just going to move on. And I just don't believe that's the way we're going to build a more diverse, inclusive community, by saying we're not going to talk about it. I think we have to talk about it.
Cancel one conversation with another. I mean, I actually just noticed up on the screen, so this is Cartersville, this sculpture. And while we do have a Confederate monument on the grounds of the courthouse, this sculpture is new and it's on the grounds of City Hall. And that was our intentional message to the community. And you can see the response there. I mean, there are things that we can do that it doesn't just have to be back and forth on the same issue. Like, let's reinvent this conversation and look at it through a new lens, and what can we add to it? And we can keep different aspects of that evolving in that way.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't have to be an either or. I mean, and I think, like Melissa said, it's not about jumping and reacting right away. It's about taking time. It's about thoughtful consideration. It's about taking a step back, putting yourself into somebody else's position and saying, how would I feel if this was me and I was trying to speak up about this and I was getting shut down, or I was told I only have 3 minutes to speak. You have to cram everything you want to say in 3 minutes. And then once 3 minutes is up, sorry guys, move to the back of the line. Because the reality is, like, we are here to serve the community, and our community wants to voice, they will tell you what they need. They will tell you what they want. We just have to listen.
Absolutely.
Guys, here, a subtext here, I think, and I think you've used the word a couple of times, is the importance of leadership. Do any of you have any sort of thoughts as we come down the home stretch here? We've got about 10 minutes or so to go. Do any of you want to offer any thoughts on specific instances of leadership that you're familiar with, or some other kind of example where leadership emerged from either the jurisdiction, the governmental system itself, or maybe one of the communities that it serves?
Wow.
Well, I think, sorry, go Melissa.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think Lily touched on a great point that she talked about having their first African American join the board. And I think for, taking elected official positions out of it, because those are determined by the general consensus of the community, but I think it's good to have an elected body that represents the community. But we have this opportunity when it comes to board appointments within the city and commissions, whether it's a planning commission, a historic preservation commission, a zoning commission, or these boards, to have diversity and inclusivity in the representation of the people who serve on it, and being intentional with that. Again, going back to making sure that our community is being represented there, and realizing that not everybody's going to reach out to you to say, hey, I would just love to sit on the planning and zoning commission. That we're going to have to be intentional in our process and making sure that we're engaging the community and reaching out to other leaders within the community to say, hey, we want to make sure that we are being more inclusive. Do you have recommendations? Do you know somebody that would be a good fit? Are there people we haven't talked to? Because we've all seen it in downtown development and community development. We have the same people doing this, all serving in all these different ways within the city and volunteer groups. And we really, again, that intentionality, and I think that's, where the leadership component comes from. Like, we have to step up and be leaders of this process, and we need to, again, be intentional in figuring out groups that we haven't interacted with and people that we haven't interacted with, and saying, okay, how can we encourage that? And, whether that's, Black fraternities or sororities at schools, or, churches, and, again, meeting people where they're at, and stop expecting people to come to us. Let's go to where the community is and ask them to be engaged.
Well, now that I've listened to you, Jessica, I've thought of two examples of leadership that are a little more grassroots, so to speak. The students at a historically Black college here in Georgia, in the southwest, I think, region, they started to gather in the downtown of the town where their college was, and they called it Fly Friday. Who doesn't want to be fly, and so here you have college students coming to the city center, coming downtown, and peaceably, hanging out, being, enjoying that built environment, getting away from campus, and bringing their spending dollars to that downtown that was struggling, and so forth. And so that type of kind of ground up type of social gathering, using downtown as a context, I thought showed some leadership. It kind of fizzled a little bit because it needed some support from the businesses and from the city itself, but I think it could be easily kind of revived. But I just wanted to point to that group of students, say, hey, let's start gathering downtown. And they kind of made it a kind of an official thing, and it started to grow, and businesses started to benefit from that gathering. Another type of grassroots leadership in the Middle Georgia region, a gentleman, 7th generation native of his particular county, came back home, working in Washington, D.C., traveling internationally, and wanted to be an inspiration, purchased some property on his main street, on his downtown corridor, and said, hey, we want to, be a part of this. We got to step in. And so took the time, pulled together support from his family. And now he's kind of offering a heritage site there where people can come and learn about the history of Black life in that particular Middle Georgia county. And he's willing to be the kind of guinea pig and have the city or the county test out whatever they're willing to do to help encourage more African-American residents to open up shop, to create that vitality, that mix that will help bring people to their particular corridor. So two examples of just, regular folks saying, hey, let's get something started. And both cases, they wanted to do it in their downtown.
Yeah. Lily, will you talk to us a little bit about the tangible and intangible outcomes of doing a project like this, your heritage trail? Kind of like, obviously we see the physical result, but what was the overall kind of impact in the community?
That sculpture that you see right there was the first thing that set off this kind of exploration, and really ultimately kind of a new opening up of one of our intentional goals for downtown. I mean, everyone was hungry for it. And, you know, I think just kind of trucking along, people were getting into the groove and forgetting that you had to take that intentionality to the community. So I would say that the tangible products, of course, were the sculptures, the trails. I mentioned that we just installed, in fact, the unveiling is Saturday, the 27th International Toni Morrison Society Bench by the Road.
And will you talk a little bit about that, what that is for people who may not know?
So Toni Morrison had said, and of course, if I try to quote it off the cuff, I won't quote it correctly, but her point was that all over the places there are monuments and tributes there to help recollect and pay homage to the history of whiteness, white achievements, white people, what have you. But there was no place, not even a bench by the road, to sit and think about the presence or absence of enslaved people, of folks who lived through all of the subsequent happenings after the forcible removal from Africa. So the intention of this project is to create space for contemplation. It is a bench by the road. It is a space. It's not exclusively for African American use, but exclusively with the intention of contemplating that experience. Ours is set here by the railroad tracks, and it is meant to reflect on the fact that these tracks were built with enslaved labor, and then later that work was continued through things like the convict slave lease or convict leasing system. I mean, it was basically slave labor, but those things being kind of contemplated as part of the African American experience, the African diaspora. And then again, once you start digging, you're discovering all sorts of firsthand history. We have found court cases that came out of the train depot here related to both kind of property and slaves pre-Civil War, and then also labor advocacy and an African American man actually winning his case in a white court, which was pretty significant. Again, kind of all revolving around the train, but also these modes of travel. It just has created a lot of openings. And again, when people feel like the door is open, they start walking through it. I mean, we don't have to, lay the path out. We just need to open the door. And I think that's speaking to leadership. That's what people in leadership need to be doing, is that, if there's not a direct path, find the indirect path. Here for our downtown, our councilman who's over downtown is also over our local African American district. And they've never really been invited to our meetings, but they're here representing both spaces. And when we create that relationship, now all of a sudden, oh, I can come downtown for this, or I can call Lily for that. And you're becoming a partner and an advocate, even if it's not exactly in your main street. I mean, these are spaces that we're creating for the community. And I think that response maybe is the most intangible, but important thing that we've seen come out of all of that. So I'll ramble all day. This has really been exciting for me. And even just from our conversation, doing the dry run, the test case for this, I've got new ideas. They will definitely keep coming once you open it up.
Yeah. And I love
Lily. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I just love that, Lily's kind of pointed out, you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to open the door and have the conversation. And I think that really goes back to, this will be my last kind of point for the day, but sometimes in local government, we decide that something's important. And so we take the data approach, which is we decide we're going to do something, we announce it to the public, and then we have to defend why we're going to do it. And Lily hit on something, which is we want to make sure that we're taking the POP approach, which is people owning the project. And the reality is, if this is a priority for us as a community, and this is something that you feel like we need to do, we just have to open the door. We just have to be willing to hear. We have to be willing to learn, willing to respond to it, but let our community dictate what that looks like, versus us saying, this is what you need to do. Right. Let the community own this process and be a part of it. And that's how we create a downtown that is inclusive and diverse, because we're saying, I can't do this. You have to do this, and I'm here to help facilitate that process. Exactly. It's your community, it's your downtown. What can I do to be a part of that?
100%.
that's a great note to sort of wind things up here, Jessica. If I can take the last minute or two of our time, I'd like to just sort of offer a couple of closing thoughts, just on some broad themes that emerged from y'all's conversation, which I thought was really nuanced and really, really interesting and engaging. You know, I'm an archaeologist. I'm certainly not a social worker or therapist, but I think it's safe to say that while the social isolation that has accompanied COVID-19 is experienced differently from person to person, it is something that virtually all of us, regardless of our individual situation, share. And it's kind of reminded us, I think, in the harshest way possible, that those things we were just talking about, those face-to-face relationships, are super important. And I think we can seize the opportunity that this awareness has presented by starting the process of establishing contacts between community leaders in different sectors of our community. People are hungry for relationships right now, I think, in the wake of this awful pandemic. And I think there was never really a better time than now to begin that building process. So if that's true, I think there's a couple of implications, and y'all have touched on these. First, those meaningful relationships, they're built on trust. As we develop those trust relationships, then we can move on to that next step, which Lily alluded to, which is conversation. And one word that I did not hear today, and although we're not in church, I'll use it anyway. An important component of these conversations has got to be grace. That doesn't mean that these conversations are quote unquote nice or easy. It means a willingness to listen, really listen, and acknowledge that all of us bring our own life experiences and perspectives to the table. And if we act on that reality, those grace-filled conversations, then you can start to open those doors that Lily alluded to. If you have those conversations, I think they help ensure that low-profile but very consequential issues are identified and addressed. And they also help ensure that places that matter, that might be invisible to, for example, me, but that are recognized by another part of our community, will be recognized. And that recognition is really a critical step in the redevelopment process. One last thought that I'll offer, Lily was talking about all the research that went into the Heritage Trail and the difficulty of finding historical evidence. And our office runs into this all the time with National Register nominations from underserved communities, because we are all trained as formal historians and understand the written records and photographic records extremely well. What we are sometimes not as good at is understanding how to explore oral history and alternative forms of history that are really important to address the resources that we all deal with. The last thing I'll say is that, to me, the big lesson, the big takeaway from today is that, however imperfectly, we do know how to attack this issue. You've heard some great examples here today from Melissa, Jessica, and Lily, and I would encourage anyone in the audience to seek our discussants out. They will be more than happy to put you in touch with some of the folks that they've been talking about. And I know those folks in turn will be more than happy to help you with their insights. So I'd like to thank everybody again for attending today's session. Great conversation, folks. And I would ask the audience to please be sure to complete those evaluations. Your opinions and ideas mean a whole lot to us. And I will turn it back to our session person running the show.
I am finished as well, Dave. Thank you.
All righty. It's great to see everybody. Y'all take care.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thanks.
Let me see if I can find my cooking. All right, you guys. Thank
All right.
you.
Bye, y'all.
See you
Bye.
later. I can't figure out how to turn this off now. It's like, is this mic on?